What if your dream flight, a celebration of everything you had built, turned into a nightmare of quiet humiliation at 35,000 feet? What if the champagne smiles given freely to others vanished when the flight attendant looked at you? And what if the very seat you paid for became a stage for prejudice? You thought the world had outgrown Ethan and Elena Carter, two young tech visionaries who turned a dorm room idea into a global empire, thought they had seen it all: boardroom battles, billion-dollar deals, rivals trying to tear them down. But nothing prepared them for the silence, the dismissive glances, the refusal of even a glass of water on Apex Flight 74. What the crew did not know was that the Carters carried more power in their smartphones than the purser carried in 20 years of service. One phone call would unravel a career, shake an airline, and ignite a global reckoning. So, how did two passengers transform an act of contempt into a movement for dignity in the skies? And what happened to the woman who thought she held all the control? Stay with us. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel. The story begins now. The first-class lounge at JFK shimmered like a private sanctuary hidden from the chaos of the terminal. Glass walls reflected golden light from hanging fixtures. Champagne flutes clinked softly, and the steady hum of conversation carried the easy cadence of people who live their lives on the other side of velvet ropes. It was a place meant for calm, meant to signal, "You belong here." Ethan Carter sat by the window, his long frame folded neatly into the armchair. His tablet glowed faintly as charts and quarterly reports scrolled across the screen. Numbers steadied him. They gave him order, precision, control. He wore a charcoal blazer over a crisp white shirt, his style understated but deliberate. A few seats away, his twin sister Elena balanced her phone between her ear and shoulder while jotting notes into a slim leather notebook. Her voice, low and steady, carried a melody of persuasion. She wasn't just closing a conversation, she was drawing someone in, weaving trust, line by line. Her smile appeared mid-sentence, the kind that disarmed venture capitalists and charmed skeptical boardrooms. At 26, the Carter twins had already lived lives that seemed impossible to most. Their company, PulseLink Technologies, was not just another Silicon Valley startup. It had become the hidden pulse of global logistics, the quiet, invisible system that kept half the Fortune 500 moving without a hitch. From a dorm room with one laptop, they had coded a platform that rerouted shipments across continents in seconds, predicted bottlenecks before they happened, and saved corporations billions. The valuation had already soared into 9 figures, and tonight they were headed to London to sign the deal that would crown them not just as young success stories, but as titans of an industry that never slept. This trip was their victory lap. Elena said, sliding into the seat next to her brother after ending her call. That investor from Berlin already circling back. Says the European press is buzzing. Ethan nodded, eyes still on his tablet. Good. Let them buzz. Momentum is leverage. Elena laughed softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She studied him for a moment. He always carried calm like a shield, even when she knew his mind was racing 10 steps ahead. For years, they had balanced each other like that. Ethan, the methodical architect, saw risk before opportunity. Elena, the visionary, the storyteller, could make a roomful of strangers believe in their dream before a single slide had been shown. Together, they were unstoppable. When the boarding announcement finally echoed through the lounge, both stood with unhurried precision. Their movements were those of people who knew time bent for them, not the other way around. They gathered their things, sleek carry-ons, laptops, a leather folio with contracts tucked neatly inside, and walked toward the gate. The jet bridge smelled faintly of rubber and disinfectant, a reminder that luxury was a veneer, not a reality. But the moment they stepped onto the aircraft, the illusion returned. First class on Sky Nova Flight 118 felt more like a private club than a cabin. Soft amber lighting traced the curves of cream leather pods. Polished wood gleamed beneath the overhead lights. The air hummed with exclusivity, with the quiet certainty that every need would be met before it was even voiced. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Halloway." A smiling attendant greeted the man ahead of them. Her voice was warm, lilting. "Champagne or sparkling water for you." The man grinned, handing her his jacket. Champagne, of course. Ethan and Elena exchanged a small glance, a silent acknowledgement of the choreography of first class. Every passenger, every gesture, scripted for ease and comfort. Then it was their turn. A woman in her late 40s stood at the door. Her blonde hair was pinned into a bun so tight it seemed carved in place. The name tag read Margaret Doyle, head purser. She had the posture of someone who had spent 2 decades owning this aisle, her authority crisp and unquestioned. Her eyes flicked down to the boarding passes, then up, then back again. For a fraction of a second, something sharp passed across her face. Confusion, irritation, the faint curl of disbelief. It was gone almost instantly, replaced by professional neutrality. 2A and 2B, she said flatly, gesturing to the left without lifting her arm fully. No welcome, no offer of champagne, no smile. The warmth that had flowed so easily toward the white man ahead of them vanished like it had never existed. Elena's lips pressed into the faintest line, but she said nothing. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, his silence speaking volumes only she could read. Their shared look said what words didn't. Did you see that they moved quietly to their seats? The pods were magnificent wide leather recliners with endless legroom, soft blankets folded with military precision, an amenity kit resting like a gift at a gala. By all measures, it was paradise. And yet, a faint chill had already settled into the air, a dissonance so subtle that only the people it was aimed at could hear its note. As they stowed their bags, Elena took a slow breath. She reminded herself of something she had repeated 1,000 times over the years. Don't give them the satisfaction. Grace is our shield. Ethan powered down his tablet and slid it into the seat pocket. His jaw was tight. "Let's just see how this goes," he murmured. The engines roared to life beneath them, a deep vibration running through the floor. The giant Boeing 777 began its pushback from the gate. Safety videos flickered across the high-definition screens, all bright smiles and curated diversity, promising unmatched service in the sky. Ethan watched with grim irony. The polished production declared attentiveness, warmth, inclusivity, yet already in the very cabin designed to epitomize that promise. The opposite had quietly unfolded. Elena's phone buzzed again with another congratulatory message. She ignored it. Tonight wasn't about investors or markets anymore. A different story had begun writing itself, one that neither twin had asked for but both would be forced to finish. As the seatbelt sign blinked on overhead and the plane rumbled toward the runway, Ethan leaned back into the plush leather. He closed his eyes briefly. A familiar tension coiled in his chest. He had felt it in boardrooms, in lobbies, in restaurants where waiters asked if he knew the price of the wine list. It was the feeling of standing in a space you had every right to occupy, yet being treated as though you were trespassing. Elena reached across the small aisle between their pods, her fingers brushing his arm. Her touch was grounding, a reminder of their unbreakable bond. "Whatever this is," she whispered, her voice calm but edged with steel, "we'll handle it. We always do." And so, as Flight 118 lifted into the night sky over New York, climbing through layers of cloud and darkness, the stage was set. The celebration they had imagined would be tested by a storm they hadn't expected. And at 35,000 feet, far above the Atlantic, prejudice would meet power in the most unforgiving of arenas. The Carters didn't know it yet, but by the time this flight landed in London, the course of more than one life would be forever changed. The cabin lights dimmed into a warm amber glow as Sky Nova Flight 118 reached its cruising altitude. The faint hum of the engines settled into a steady rhythm, a background score to the rituals of first-class luxury. Passengers reclined into their pods, jackets already hung, shoes slipped off, feet resting against padded ottomans. Margaret Doyle glided down the aisle with the grace of someone who had owned this space for 20 years. Her uniform was impeccable, not a wrinkle in sight. The silk scarf at her neck folded so precisely it looked machine-stitched. To most passengers, she was the image of professional care. To Ethan and Elena Carter, she was the image of something else entirely. She stopped at seat 1A, where Robert Jenkins, a silver-haired gentleman in his late 60s, adjusted his cufflinks. Margaret bent slightly, her smile soft and practiced. "Mr. Jenkins, so lovely to see you again. Would you care for your usual?" The older man chuckled. "You remember I'll have the Macallan neat." "Of course," Margaret replied warmly, jotting it down with a flourish. She touched his arm briefly, a gesture of familiarity that carried weight in this small, enclosed world. Elena watched the exchange from her seat in 2B. She noticed how Margaret's posture leaned in, how her voice carried that note of intimacy reserved for long-time customers. Then, with a subtle shift, the warmth vanished. Margaret straightened, her face cooling into neutrality as she pivoted toward the next row. "Mrs. O'Connor," she said with equal warmth, addressing a woman across the aisle, the Sauvignon Blanc. "Yes." The woman nodded, smiling as if reassured she was being cared for by a professional who anticipated her needs. Then Margaret reached row 2, where Ethan and Elena sat side by side. She paused, pen in hand, eyes flicking briefly toward them. The air seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, it appeared she might finally extend the same courtesy, but instead, she angled her body toward the opposite side of the aisle, deliberately bypassing the Carters as though their seats were empty. "Mr. Alvarez," she said brightly, addressing a man in 2D. "Still mineral water with lemon." "Yes." "Thank you," the man replied, pleased. Ethan lifted his hand slightly, a polite signal. Margaret's eyes caught the motion. He was certain of it. But she turned back toward the galley, scribbling notes on her pad, her expression a mask of professional indifference. A silence filled the space between the twins. "You saw that?" "Right," Ethan murmured, his voice calm but edged. Elena nodded once, her jaw tightening. "I saw it." They had grown up with these moments. Small, sharp cuts delivered in polished packaging. Teachers who doubted their answers, even when correct. Investors who asked if they were interns at their own pitch meetings. Hotel clerks who demanded to see 3 forms of ID before releasing their room keys. Subtle, almost deniable gestures. Never quite enough for a headline, but always enough to leave a scar. The irony was bitter. Here they sat, in first class on one of the world's most prestigious airlines, their tickets costing more than some families made in a month, and still, they were invisible. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "We could let it go," he said. Elena turned toward him, her eyes sharp in the soft cabin light. "Do you want to?" He didn't answer, because he didn't. Across the aisle, Margaret continued her choreography of service. She delivered hot towels to passengers with a flourish, silver tongs clicking gently as she laid them down. She described wines with poetic detail, rattled off entrees like a maître d' at a Michelin-starred restaurant. But when she reached row 2 again, she leaned across Ethan's seat to serve Mrs. O'Connor her second glass of wine, her arm brushing close enough for Ethan to smell the powdery perfume on her wrist. She didn't glance at him. Not once. Elena's lips curved into the faintest, coldest smile. "Cloaking device," she whispered. Ethan chuckled, though the humor was bitter. Apparently, the laughter died quickly, because the longer it went on, the clearer it became this wasn't an oversight, it was a choice. Passengers around them noticed, too. Robert Jenkins glanced back from 1A, his brow furrowing briefly before he turned away. "Mrs." O'Connor's eyes darted toward the twins, then away, as though she didn't want to be caught staring. No one said a word. The bystander silence, familiar as gravity. Elena reached for her phone, scrolling absently, though her mind wasn't on the glowing screen. Her thoughts spun back to Stanford, to the night she and Ethan first pitched PulseLink in front of a panel of skeptical judges. She had felt this same tightness in her chest when one of them leaned back and said, "Impressive for your age. But this seems a bit ambitious." That same doubt lingered now, painted across Margaret's dismissive glance. Inside her, two forces collided. One wanted to stand up, to call it out, to demand acknowledgement. The other reminded her of the cost. She had lived too long in a world where black anger was twisted into a weapon against the very person who expressed it. She closed her eyes briefly, grounding herself. Not yet. Watch. Wait. Ethan. Meanwhile, had already opened the Notes app on his phone. His fingers moved swiftly, recording timestamps, tiny details. He wasn't angry. Anger clouded data. And data, cold and precise, was their greatest weapon. 10:42 p.m. EST. Flight reaches cruising altitude. 10:55 p.m. EST. Hot towels distributed. All passengers served except 2A and 2B. 11:02 p.m. EST. Drink orders taken. Head purser, Margaret Doyle, skipped row 2. Acknowledged 2D. Ignored 2A and 2B. Each entry was a stone, laid carefully, building a wall of evidence. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the galley, mingling with the faint sweetness of champagne. Glasses clinked, cutlery shifted. The cabin played its usual symphony of comfort. Yet, for Ethan and Elena, the notes rang false, discordant. Elena leaned closer, her voice a whisper meant only for her brother. "You know what this is?" He nodded. "Of course. It's a tactic. Make us feel out of place. Make us wonder if we belong." Ethan's expression was unreadable. "Do we?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the engines roaring outside. Of course, they belonged. They had bought their tickets, earned their wealth, built their empire. But that wasn't the question Margaret was asking. She wasn't questioning their right to the seat. She was questioning their right to dignity. Elena's hand tightened on the armrest. Her mind raced through a catalog of battles past, each one leaving a scar that shaped her resolve. She remembered coding late into the night in their dorm, surviving on vending machine snacks while classmates partied. She remembered the first investor who dismissed her presentation, then turned to Ethan and said, "Maybe you should do the talking." She remembered the night their platform crashed in beta testing and they rebuilt it line by line until dawn, proving everyone wrong. This flight was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be a celebration, the moment when they finally let themselves breathe. But prejudice, she thought grimly, never respected calendars. Margaret returned down the aisle, balancing a tray of champagne flutes that sparkled in the dim light. She stopped at Mr. Alvarez, her smile wide. "Another for you." "Sir, yes, please," he replied, taking the glass. She passed directly by Ethan and Elena again, the tray tilting slightly, as though they were ghosts, unworthy of acknowledgement. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He added another line to his notes. 11:18 p.m. EST. Attempted to signal attendant. Ignored. Elena felt her pulse thrum, slow and steady. She closed her notebook, sliding it into the side compartment of her seat. She leaned back, her gaze fixed on the headrest in front of her. "This isn't over," she whispered, and she was right. Because beneath the calm, beneath the quiet dignity, something powerful was gathering. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even hurt. It was resolve, sharpened like steel, waiting for the right moment to strike. By the time Margaret Doyle finally circled back with menus, placing them wordlessly on the twins' trays without eye contact, the atmosphere of the cabin had shifted. Other passengers might not have spoken, but they felt it too. The absence of kindness was louder than any outburst. The Carters had been made invisible. But what Margaret couldn't see, what she would never understand, was that invisibility in their hands was never weakness. It was strategy. And strategy, once set in motion, had the power to bring down entire empires. The hum of the engines had settled into the kind of steady drone that could lull most passengers into comfort. But for Ethan and Elena Carter, comfort was the one thing missing. They had flown countless times before business class, first class, even private jets on rare occasions when investors insisted, but this flight was different. The celebratory energy that had carried them onto the plane now sat heavy in their chests. The mood had shifted. Margaret Doyle moved with brisk efficiency, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpet. She carried herself like she owned the cabin. And perhaps, in her mind, she did. For 20 years, she had controlled this space, decided who got the warmest smile, who deserved an extra glass of champagne, and who barely warranted a glance. When the hot towels appeared, Margaret began the ritual with the kind of flourish that suggested a ceremony rather than a simple act of service. Silver tongs in hand, she placed steaming towels before Robert Jenkins in 1A and offered them with a quiet, "For you, sir." She continued her way down the aisle, bowing slightly as she offered towels to Mrs. O'Connor and Mr. Alvarez. Her voice carried subtle notes of deference and respect, an acknowledgement of their presence. But when she reached row 2, she hesitated. For the briefest moment, her eyes flickered toward Ethan and Elena. Then, as if making a deliberate choice, she pivoted away. She leaned across Ethan's shoulder, not to hand him a towel, but to pass one to the passenger behind him. The scent of the towel's faint lavender drifted past, taunting in its absence. Elena's fingers tightened around the armrest. She breathed in deeply, steadying herself. The gesture wasn't just rude, it was intentional. "They skipped us," Ethan said under his breath, his tone even but sharp. "I know," Elena replied. Margaret continued on, her tray lighter, her expression unchanged. Across the cabin, a younger attendant, Sophie Lee, her nameplate read, "Distributed towels on the starboard side." Her movements were slower, less polished, but she met each passenger's eyes with genuine kindness. She smiled, small and sincere, as she set a towel before Mrs. Maya Patel in 3D. Elena watched her, noting the contrast. Margaret wasn't simply overworked or distracted. She was making a statement. Elena's phone buzzed on her tray table, the screen lighting up with yet another congratulatory message. She turned it over, silencing the vibration. There was no celebrating here. Not now. The minutes ticked by, punctuated by the faint sounds of cutlery being prepared, glasses clinking faintly in the galley. The air smelled faintly of roasted garlic and butter, promises of the meal service to come. Margaret returned with her notepad in hand. She began taking drink orders. "Mr. Jenkins," she said warmly, "your Macallan is on its way. Would you care for sparkling water alongside it?" "Perfect, thank you." She moved to Mrs. O'Connor, then to Mr. Alvarez, scribbling notes, her head tilting in a listening posture. Her tone was careful, deferential, the kind of tone that made passengers feel special. When she reached the Carters' row, Ethan leaned forward slightly, ready to order, but Margaret didn't stop. She leaned across his seat once again, addressing the passenger behind him. Mrs. Patel, another Sauvignon Blanc. Yes, thank you, Mrs. Patel said with a smile, clearly unaware of the cruelty in the moment. Margaret wrote the order, snapped her notepad shut, and pivoted down the aisle toward the galley. The Carters were invisible again. Ethan exhaled slowly, his lips pressed into a thin line. His hand moved back to his phone, tapping another entry into his growing log. 11:05 p.m. East. Hot towel service. Skipped row 2. 11:15 p.m. EST. Drink orders taken. Skipped row 2. He kept his face neutral, his body language calm, as if he were merely jotting notes for work. But his pulse ticked faster. Every word entered into his notes felt like ammunition, quiet and cold. Elena tilted her head back against the leather headrest. She stared at the ceiling panels, tracing the subtle lines of the cabin design. Her mind wasn't on the plane. It was back in California, in the early days of PulseLink, when they pitched investors in cramped conference rooms. She remembered sitting across from a man in a gray suit who had leaned back, smiled faintly, and said, "I just don't know if founders like you are the right fit for this kind of space. Founders like you." The words had echoed then, the way Margaret's indifference echoed now. The seatbelt sign dinged softly overhead, though turbulence was nowhere in sight. It felt symbolic somehow, a reminder that at any moment the smoothest flight could become rough. 10 minutes later, the clink of glass announced the arrival of drinks. Margaret carried a tray with elegant flutes and tumblers, condensation beating down their sides. She moved down the aisle, presenting each drink with grace. "Your scotch, Mr. Jenkins. Another glass of wine for you, Mrs. O'Connor. Mineral water for Mr. Alvarez." She placed each drink carefully, adding a few words of acknowledgement, her smile unfailing. When she reached row 2, she hesitated again. Ethan and Elena waited, their trays bare, their gazes calm but steady. Margaret didn't stop. She walked past them, serving Mrs. Patel instead. The click of her heels receded down the aisle, leaving silence in her wake. Elena leaned toward her brother. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried a sharp edge. "This isn't neglect. This is a tactic." Ethan nodded. "I know. She wants us to lose our composure." To prove her point, Ethan's eyes stayed on his phone screen. "Then we don't give her that." He added another note, 11:25 p.m. EST. Drinks distributed, row 2 skipped. The minutes stretched. Other passengers sipped champagne, their glasses catching the cabin light. The quiet exclusivity of first class played out, as it always did, except for the 2 young entrepreneurs in the middle of it, made to feel like intruders. The silence grew heavier, until finally Elena spoke again, her words low, controlled. "Do you ever get tired of this?" Ethan looked at her, his brow furrowed. Of what? Of being tested, of having to prove we belong in places we've already paid for. Her eyes glistened briefly, though no tears fell. She wasn't asking him for comfort. She was voicing something deeper, something that lived in both of them. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked out the window instead, the endless darkness of the Atlantic stretching below. "All the time," he said finally. His voice was calm, but heavy. "But tired doesn't change anything." Elena leaned back again, her gaze fixed forward. She pressed her lips together, sealing the words she wanted to release. If she spoke them now, they would come out sharp, cutting, Exactly what Margaret wanted. The meal service loomed ahead. The smell of seared meat and fresh bread rolled through the cabin, carried by unseen currents. Trays were prepared, cutlery polished. The ritual of fine dining in the sky was about to begin, and the Carters knew without question that their turn in Margaret's choreography would come with another omission, another insult. But they also knew something Margaret didn't. They weren't just passengers. They weren't just customers. They were observers, documenters, strategists. Every skipped towel, every denied glass of water, every flicker of disdain was fuel. They had built an empire from nothing, line by line of code, brick by brick of strategy. They could endure a flight. They could endure much worse, because prejudice, dressed up in a uniform and pearls, was still prejudice. And they had learned long ago that the best response wasn't fury, it was evidence. By the time Margaret returned with menus, placing them silently on their trays without eye contact, Ethan had already typed the words that would, hours later, carry the weight of a verdict. 11:40 p.m. EST. Menus distributed. Row 2 placed silently. No acknowledgement. Elena glanced at her brother's phone. She met his eyes, and for the first time since the flight began, a flicker of a smile touched her lips. "Keep writing," she whispered, because she knew. Every empire fell not by force, but by the weight of its own arrogance. And Margaret Doyle was building hers, one omission at a time. The quiet hum of the cabin grew heavier as the first-class dinner service prepared to unfold. For most passengers, it was the highlight of the evening, a culinary performance staged at 35,000 feet. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, and carefully plated dishes turned the cabin into a floating restaurant. For Ethan and Elena Carter, though, it was another stage where the game of exclusion would play out. Margaret Doyle reappeared, notepad in hand, her posture rigid, her face carefully composed. She started with Mr. Jenkins in 1A, bending slightly, her voice warm. "The seared salmon with truffle risotto is excellent tonight, sir. Would you like that? Or, the filet mignon, I'll go with the salmon," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice cordial. Margaret wrote it down, then moved to Mrs. O'Connor. "The chicken roulade tonight is particularly tender," she said, adding a little tilt of her head as if sharing a secret. Mrs. O'Connor smiled. "Then I'll try that." When Margaret reached row 2, her demeanor shifted. She didn't bend. She didn't smile. She stood upright, as if this was an unpleasant task she couldn't avoid. Her pen hovered above the notepad. "Your choices?" she asked flatly, her gaze fixed somewhere over Ethan's shoulder. Elena looked at her squarely, her voice calm. "I'll have the halibut, please." Margaret scribbled without acknowledgement, "And I'll take the filet mignon, medium rare." Ethan added, "And for your drinks," Margaret's tone carried a saccharine bite, a condescension that suggested they should be grateful to be asked at all. "Sparkling water with lime," Elena said. "The same for me." Ethan followed. Margaret smirked faintly, a curl of lips that wasn't kindness, but contempt. Of course. She turned sharply and walked away without another word. The cabin felt smaller after she left, like the air itself had been thinned. Ethan set his jaw, fingers tapping his phone screen as he logged the exchange. Elena stared at her hands folded neatly on her lap. Her nails painted a subtle nude shade. She focused on her breathing, a slow rhythm to keep the frustration from boiling over. When the appetizers came, the contrast was stark. Mr. Jenkins's tray arrived first, linen spread across his table, silverware placed with care, a small plate of smoked salmon and creme fraiche set delicately before him. Margaret offered him a soft, "Enjoy." Mrs. O'Connor and Mr. Alvarez received their plates next, complete with garnish and attentive explanation of the flavors. But when Margaret reached row 2, her performance faltered. She dropped the plates in front of the twins without ceremony. The thud of porcelain on wood was louder than it should have been, echoing with disdain. No linen, no words, just plates. Elena's halibut was lukewarm, the edges dry, the sauce congealed. Ethan's filet mignon, promised medium rare, was gray all the way through, stiff and unyielding. It was not the mistake of a kitchen. It was deliberate. Ethan cut into his steak, revealing the overcooked interior. He placed his knife and fork down deliberately, his expression calm. He would not give Margaret the satisfaction of a complaint made in anger. Margaret passed their row 3 times as she refilled wine glasses, leaning in close to laugh with Mrs. O'Connor, adjusting napkins for Mr. Alvarez. She never looked at Ethan's untouched plate. Around them, silence thickened. Other passengers noticed. The unspoken rules of civility on an airplane demanded looking away, pretending not to see. But eyes lingered, quick glances, awkward shifts. The injustice was visible, undeniable. Elena finally broke the silence between them. Her voice was low, steady, but edged with steel. She thinks we don't belong here. Ethan didn't look away from his plate. She wants us to react, to fit the story she's already written in her head. And what story is that, Elena asked, though she already knew? That we're loud, difficult, angry. Elena exhaled, her gaze fixed on Margaret at the front of the cabin. Then we won't give her the ending she wants. 15 minutes crawled by. Ethan's plate remained untouched. Margaret swept through the aisles, clearing others, refilling drinks, complimenting choices. Each time she passed row 2, the omission became more glaring, more intentional. Elena pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded above their seats, the blue light glowing. Margaret glanced in their direction from the galley, her lips tightening, but she didn't move. Instead, she busied herself with stacking trays, her back deliberately turned. Elena pressed it again, and again. Finally, with an audible sigh that reached half the cabin, Margaret marched toward them. She stopped at their row, arms crossed, her expression carved from disdain. "Is there a problem?" Elena looked at her steadily. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but every word was laced with the gravity of truth. "Yes, my brother's steak is inedible. It's been cooked beyond recognition. And from the moment we stepped on this plane, we have been ignored, dismissed, and treated with utter contempt." The words landed like a gavel strike. The cabin fell silent. Margaret's face hardened, her mask of false professionalism shattered, revealing something harsher underneath. Her voice dropped, sharp and venomous. "I am the head purser on this flight. I've been with Sky Nova for 20 years. I decide the pace of service in my cabin. If you're unhappy, you can file a complaint when we land." Ethan spoke then, his voice calm, deliberate. "We are unhappy now. We are first-class passengers who paid for service we are not receiving. What we are receiving feels like targeted discrimination." The word hung in the air like a spark to gasoline. Margaret's composure cracked. Her voice rose, tinged with rage. "How dare you? I am treating you exactly as you deserve. I don't know how you people manage to afford these tickets." She stopped, but the implication lingered, thick and poisonous. A collective gasp spread through the cabin. Mr. Jenkins in 1A recoiled. Mrs. Patel in 3D put a hand to her mouth. The polite silence of first class had been shattered by words too sharp, too cruel to ignore. Elena's eyes narrowed, her expression freezing into something colder than anger. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply said, "Thank you, Margaret. You've told us everything we need to know." She reached for her phone. Margaret scoffed. "What are you going to do? Tweet about it? Go ahead. The company has a whole department for people like you." Elena ignored her. She unlocked her phone, her thumb hovering over a name in her favorites. A name she had never used in public, but one that carried enough weight to bring entire companies to their knees. She looked at Ethan. He gave a single, subtle nod. And Elena pressed the call button on her screen. The hum of the engines seemed louder suddenly. The cabin held its breath. Margaret sneered, mistaking calm for bluff. But Ethan and Elena Carter were not bluffing. They were dialing power. And Margaret Doyle had no idea just how quickly her 20-year career was about to unravel. The cabin air felt electric, charged with an energy that no one could ignore. The polite hush of first class had been replaced by a silence so thick it carried weight. Eyes darted toward row 2, then away again, as if staring too long might burn. The unspoken code of passengers, "Mind your business, keep your head down," had been broken. Margaret Doyle's words had cut too deeply to pretend nothing had happened. Ethan Carter sat motionless in his seat, his face calm but his eyes burning with quiet fury. He had lived through enough boardroom ambushes and veiled slights to recognize when a line had been crossed beyond repair. Margaret hadn't just denied them towels or served an overcooked steak. She had said out loud what she had been broadcasting in every cold gesture since the moment they boarded. "You people." 2 words that carried centuries of venom. 2 words that turned first class into a courtroom, every passenger a witness. Elena Carter didn't blink. She didn't let the anger crack her voice or pull her into shouting. She knew better. She had faced venture capitalists who dismissed her ideas as too ambitious, engineers who questioned if she had actually written her own code, executives who smiled politely while planning to edge her out of her own company. She had learned the art of composure the hard way. Now, that composure became her weapon. "Thank you, Margaret," Elena said softly, her words like shards of ice. "You've told us everything we need to know." She pulled out her phone. Margaret smirked, folding her arms across her chest. "What are you going to do? Tweet about it, make a video. Go ahead. The airline has people for that. Complaints get lost in the system every day." Elena ignored her. Her thumb hovered over a name in her favorites. Not an executive, not a PR manager, not anyone Margaret could dismiss. This name belonged to someone who made CEOs nervous and left boardrooms scrambling. Victor Harrington. To the world, he was a billionaire investor, a kingmaker who had shaped industries from the shadows. To the twins, he was more than that. He had been their mentor since college, the man who had written the first angel check for PulseLink Technologies, the one who believed in them before the market did. And he had told them, in his gravelly voice that carried the weight of decades in power, "If you ever need me, ever call." Elena didn't hesitate. She pressed his name. The Wi-Fi connection held strong, crisp enough to make the call feel intimate despite the Atlantic stretched out below. The phone rang once, twice. "Victor Harrington," came the deep voice, firm and steady. "Victor, it's Elena Carter," she said, her voice composed, even gentle. "My apologies for calling so late. Ethan and I are on Sky Nova Flight 118 headed to London. Yes, the deal is finalized." "Thank you." "We're grateful." Margaret's smirk widened, mistaking calm for weakness. In her mind, this was theater, an empty attempt to look powerful in front of strangers. But Elena's words sharpened. "We have a situation with the head purser. Her name is Margaret Doyle. Since boarding, she has systematically denied us service hot towels, drinks, basic respect, Tonight she escalated to direct verbal abuse. She told us, and I quote, "I don't know how you people afforded these tickets." Gasps rippled again through the cabin. Even those who had been pretending to look away were now openly staring. Mr. Jenkins in 1A unbuckled his belt and stood. He walked slowly to Elena's seat, his face grave. "Excuse me, Ms. Carter," he said in a low voice. "My name is Robert Jenkins. I've been watching this unfold since we boarded. I will testify to every word, every action I've seen tonight. This is the most disgraceful behavior I've ever witnessed on an aircraft." He handed her his business card, former litigator, now retired. "If your contact needs corroboration, I'm happy to provide it." Elena accepted the card with a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins." She lifted the phone slightly. "Victor, you heard that." On the other end, silence. The kind of silence that felt like a storm gathering force. Then Victor's voice returned, calm but edged with fire. "Put her on the phone." Margaret's smirk faltered. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her eyes. Elena held the phone out toward her. "He'd like to speak with you." Margaret recoiled as if the device were a venomous snake. "I don't know who this is, but I don't take orders from passengers." Elena returned the phone to her ear. "She refuses." Victor didn't miss a beat. "It doesn't matter. The captain of that flight is Daniel Morales. He's a good man. I'm calling him directly on the cockpit line right now. Sit tight. This will be resolved in minutes." The line went dead. Margaret's eyes narrowed, confusion battling arrogance. The captain isn't going to take orders from some crank caller, but less than 2 minutes later, the curtain to the cockpit rustled. Captain Morales emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform impeccable, his face grim. His presence commanded silence. His eyes scanned the cabin before landing on row 2. Ethan and Elena sat calmly, phones resting on the armrest. Margaret stood rigid, color draining from her cheeks. Robert Jenkins stood nearby, arms folded, his expression carved from stone. "Ms. Doyle," the captain said, his voice a low command, a word. "In the galley. Now." Margaret's body stiffened. She hesitated, her lips parting as if to argue. "Now," the captain repeated, sharper. With reluctant steps, Margaret followed him to the galley. The curtain closed behind them. The muffled voices that followed carried no words the passengers could decipher, but the tones were clear. The captain's voice, low, firm, furious. Margaret's voice high-pitched, defensive, pleading. 5 minutes later, Captain Morales re-emerged. His face was set in lines of apology. He walked directly to Ethan and Elena, bending slightly so his words carried to them alone. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Carter, on behalf of Sky Nova and on a personal level, I am deeply sorry for the treatment you've endured. There are no excuses. This is an embarrassment to this airline and to my crew. Please accept my sincere apologies." "Thank you, Captain," Ethan said, his voice measured. "Effective immediately." "Ms. Doyle has been relieved of duty." The captain continued. "She will remain in the crew rest area until landing, where she will be escorted by corporate security. Her employment with Sky Nova is terminated." The words stunned the cabin. Fired, mid-flight. The head purser of a transatlantic route, dismissed on the spot. The captain's voice carried further now, addressing the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. Please enjoy the remainder of your flight. Our remaining crew will provide the service you deserve." He turned back to Ethan and Elena. "We've credited your accounts with compensation and additional benefits, but more importantly, I will personally see to it that this never happens on any flight under my command again." Elena nodded, her composure unbroken. "Your handling of this means more than the compensation, Captain." Thank you. He inclined his head before returning to the cockpit. The silence that followed wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverence. Passengers glanced toward the twins, not with pity, but with respect. Chloe, the younger attendant, approached nervously, her hands trembling slightly as she carried a tray. "I'll be serving you for the rest of the flight," she said softly. "I am so sorry. I didn't know how to step in. Margaret, she was very senior." Ethan gave her a gentle smile. "It's not your fault. Chloe, we'll just have those sparkling waters now, please," as she hurried away. Elena leaned back into her seat, finally letting her shoulders drop. She exhaled slowly, tension bleeding from her body. She glanced at Ethan. He met her gaze, and for a moment, the unspoken exhaustion of fighting this battle over and over in different rooms with different faces passed between them. It wasn't victory. It wasn't celebration. It was survival, once again. But this time, survival had left a mark. And by the time this story left the walls of this aircraft, Margaret Doyle's fall from grace would be more than personal. It would be public and irreversible. For several long moments after Captain Morales returned to the cockpit, the first-class cabin felt like a chapel. Not the bright, celebratory kind filled with music, but the hushed, awestruck silence that comes after a thunderclap has rolled through the sky. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending to return to books or screens, but their eyes betrayed them, flicking toward row 2 again and again. Ethan Carter sat perfectly upright, his hands folded loosely on his lap. He looked calm, but Elena knew better. She could read the slight tightening of his jaw, the way he pressed his tongue against the inside of his cheek. Her brother was boiling inside, though he would never let it show. That was Ethan's way fury converted into stillness, a weapon of patience. Elena herself felt the fatigue seeping in. Her body trembled not from fear, but from the sheer effort of holding everything together. She had spoken with the same even tone she used in boardrooms, but inside she had wanted to scream. Margaret's words had pierced like daggers, but screaming would have meant surrendering to the stereotype that had haunted them their whole lives. Angry, difficult, out of place. Instead, she had chosen the colder weapon strategy. And now, as she leaned back in her cream leather seat, she wondered whether she had traded a piece of her soul for it. The curtain to the galley rustled briefly. Margaret Doyle was gone now, hidden away in the crew rest compartment, stripped of her authority. The thought should have brought satisfaction, but for Ethan and Elena, satisfaction was never the point. It was justice they sought, justice and dignity, and even that felt complicated. Chloe, the young attendant, returned with 2 glasses of sparkling water on a silver tray. Her hands shook as she placed them on the twins' tables. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her eyes wide and shining. "I've never seen anything like that before. She controlled everything. I thought if I spoke up, I'd lose my job." Ethan gave her a gentle nod. "We understand, Chloe. Fear can make silence feel like safety. But silence is heavy. It sits with you. What matters is what you do after the silence ends." Chloe's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She nodded once, then hurried back down the aisle. Ethan lifted his glass. "To surviving another storm," he said quietly. Elena clinked hers against his, and to making sure the world hears it. The bubbles fizzed on her tongue, a strangely sharp reminder that life continued even in the middle of upheaval. Across the aisle, Robert Jenkins gave them a respectful nod. He was typing furiously on his laptop, the glow of the screen lighting his face. Ethan suspected he was already drafting his letter, already shaping the words that would carry tonight's events far beyond the fuselage. The hum of the engines filled the silence. Outside the windows, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, dark and cold, indifferent to the drama unfolding above it. Elena turned her face toward the glass. Her reflection stared back, layered over the faint outline of stars. She thought of their parents back in Atlanta, the long nights their mother worked double shifts at the hospital, the quiet discipline of their father balancing bills and dreams. She thought of the nights she and Ethan had coded side by side in their dorm, too broke for proper meals, but too driven to stop. Every obstacle had been met with determination, but sometimes she wondered how many more times they would have to prove they belonged. "Ethan," she said softly, "do you ever get tired of fighting the same battle in different rooms?" He exhaled slowly. "Every day. But I also remember why we fight, because if we don't, someone else has to. And maybe they won't be ready. Maybe they won't have the tools. We do." She let his words sink in. They weren't comfort. Ethan never dealt in comfort, but they were truth. The meal service resumed cautiously. Chloe approached again, this time with careful ceremony. She placed new white tablecloths over their trays, smoothing them with trembling hands. Then came the plates of perfectly seared filet for Ethan, glistening pink at the center, and a halibut for Elena that flaked under the touch of her fork. The food was hot, fragrant, prepared as it should have been from the start. "Enjoy your meals," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. Elena caught her hand gently before she left. "Thank you," she said, and Chloe's eyes glistened with gratitude. The cabin slowly thawed. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before, as though passengers feared breaking the fragile peace. Some glanced at the twins with small smiles of solidarity. Others avoided eye contact, ashamed of their earlier silence. Ethan cut into his steak, savoring the tenderness. But his mind wasn't on the food. It was on the phone call, the speed with which Victor Harrington had moved. He could still hear the steel in Victor's voice, the immediacy of power in action. It was a reminder that influence wasn't just about money or titles. It was about loyalty, about standing up when it counted. Elena ate slowly, her appetite dulled by the weight of it all. Her mind wandered back to Margaret. Right now, she was sitting in a cramped bunk, stripped of the authority she had wielded so viciously. Did she feel regret, shame, or was she rehearsing excuses in her head, telling herself the Carters had overreacted, that they had played some card Elena suspected the latter? People rarely admitted the ugliness of their own reflection. And yet, the thought brought her no joy. Margaret's fall didn't erase the sting of her words. It didn't erase the centuries behind them. Hours stretched on. The cabin dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight, windows shuttered, lights softened. Most passengers slipped into sleep, their breathing steady, the hum of engines like a lullaby. But Ethan and Elena lay awake. Ethan scrolled through his notes, rereading the precise timeline he had built. Each entry was a piece of evidence, unshakable, undeniable. He thought of releasing it, of letting the world see how prejudice unfolded in real time, but he also thought of the burden, how their names might be dragged, how their success could be twisted into arrogance. Elena stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a storm. She replayed Margaret's smirk, the disdain in her voice, the way she had leaned over Ethan as though he were invisible. Rage flickered again, hot and corrosive. But alongside it came something else, resolve. Margaret had tried to reduce them, to make them smaller. Instead, she had handed them a platform, one they had not sought, but one they would use. Eventually, exhaustion overcame them. The twins dozed lightly, side by side, their breath synchronized, the bond of their shared history like a shield around them. When they woke, the cabin was stirring again. Breakfast service was beginning. Chloe approached with fresh fruit, warm croissants, steaming coffee. Her eyes were steady now, her hands no longer trembling. It seemed the act of serving them properly had restored some of her confidence. "Thank you, Chloe," Ethan said, meeting her gaze. She smiled faintly. "You deserve better than what happened. I'll remember this. I won't stay silent again." Ethan and Elena exchanged a glance. That, perhaps, was the smallest but most important victory of the night, not just the punishment of injustice, but the awakening of someone who might one day stand against it. As the aircraft began its slow descent toward London, the twins sat quietly, watching the pale light of dawn break across the horizon. The worst was behind them, but the ripples of the night's events were only beginning. Down below, cameras, headlines, and consequences waited, and neither of them knew just how far the storm they had endured in the sky would reach once their story touched the ground. The wheels of Flight 74 kissed the tarmac at Heathrow with a muted thud, the kind of landing that would usually draw polite applause in the cabin. But this time, there was no applause. The first-class passengers were too busy exchanging glances, still processing the drama they had witnessed overnight. Ethan Carter felt the slight jolt run through the fuselage and looked out at the gray drizzle streaking the window. London, a city that had always symbolized opportunity to him. Yet this time it carried the residue of humiliation, of a fight he and his sister had not chosen but had been forced to wage. Elena sat upright, fastening her blazer with deliberate calm. Her phone buzzed with messages, congratulations on their deal, meeting reminders, and a growing flurry of missed calls from unknown numbers. Word was already spreading. Stories traveled faster than airplanes in the digital age. The seatbelt sign pinged off. Chloe approached cautiously. "Mr. Carter." "Ms. Carter," she said softly. "The captain has asked if you'd be willing to disembark last. There are representatives waiting at the gate." Elena's brows lifted slightly. Representatives? Chloe's eyes flicked away. Corporate security, and a few others. She didn't elaborate. Ethan gave a small nod. "That's fine." The curtain parted, and passengers filed out. Some stopped briefly, murmuring words of support. Robert Jenkins, the retired attorney, placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'll be in touch," he said quietly. "People need to hear this." His laptop bag was slung across his chest, the weight of his words carrying more force than the gesture itself. One by one, the others left, some embarrassed, others sympathetic. A few avoided eye contact entirely, unwilling to engage. The silence of complicity still lingered in their retreating footsteps. When the cabin was empty, Chloe exhaled, relief flickering across her features. "They'll meet you right at the jet bridge. Please, don't hold this against everyone here. Some of us want things to change." Elena's expression softened. "We know, Chloe. Change begins when someone decides silence isn't enough. Maybe that's you." Chloe's eyes glistened, and she nodded. The Carters rose, collected their sleek carry-ons, and walked toward the forward door. Captain Morales stood waiting, his cap under his arm, his expression solemn. He extended a hand to each of them. "On behalf of Sky Nova," he said firmly, "I apologize again. What happened on this aircraft was unacceptable. I will be filing my own report with corporate and the Civil Aviation Authority. This will not disappear into bureaucracy." "Thank you, Captain," Ethan replied, gripping his hand. "We appreciate your integrity." The door opened, and the cool, damp air of London rushed in. Two men in dark suits stood at the threshold, badges clipped to their belts. Behind them, a woman with a leather folio and the sharp gaze of someone used to crisis management. "Mr. and Ms. Carter," one of the men said, his tone clipped but polite. We're here to escort you to a private lounge. The airline would like to speak with you before you leave the airport." Elena's lips twitched into the faintest smile. Of course they would. The walk through the jet bridge felt so real. Usually, the end of a long-haul flight brought relief, fatigue, the anticipation of a new city. Now it felt like a corridor of judgment, each step carrying the weight of unseen eyes and whispered headlines. The private lounge was a glass-walled sanctuary tucked away from the bustle of Heathrow's terminal. Inside, a small team awaited two executives in tailored suits, the woman with the folio and a PR officer whose nervous smile failed to disguise the panic in his eyes. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Carter," one of the executives began, his tone overly smooth. "We deeply regret the incident that occurred on board. Please know it does not reflect Skynova's values. We have already taken swift action to remove the employee responsible. We'd like to offer compensation," and Ethan held up a hand. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried the same weight that had quieted boardrooms. "With respect, this isn't about compensation. It's about accountability. Your head purser didn't just have a bad night. She carried out a deliberate campaign of discrimination, and she did so with the confidence of someone who believed she'd never face consequences. That tells us this is bigger than one person." The room stilled. Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice like tempered steel. "We don't want free flights or upgrades. What we want is change, training, protocols, oversight, real accountability. Because until you fix the culture that enables someone like Margaret Doyle to thrive for 20 years, this will happen again." The PR officer swallowed audibly. The executives exchanged a glance, their polished facades cracking just slightly under the precision of the twins' words. "We will take this under advisement," the second executive stammered. "You'll do more than that," Elena said, her tone soft but unyielding. "Because this story won't stay in this room. It's already moving, almost on cue." Ethan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen notifications exploding, tags multiplying. A trending hashtag was already forming. Sky Nova discrimination. The executives paled. They knew what that meant. Once a story hit the bloodstream of social media, no press release could contain it. Ethan pocketed his phone. "We'll let the world watch how you respond. That's the only form of accountability that matters." The meeting ended quickly after that, the executives eager to escape the firestorm they couldn't control. Security escorted the Carters through a back corridor, past curious airport staff whose eyes followed them like they were dignitaries or insurgents. When they stepped into the arrivals hall, the scene waiting for them was nothing short of chaos. A cluster of reporters pressed against barriers, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Their names had leaked, their faces identified. The twins were no longer anonymous passengers. They were the story. Elena. Ethan did the flight attendant really say, "You people? Are you planning legal action? What message do you have for Skynova passengers of color?" The questions came in a barrage. The Carters paused only briefly. Elena met the swarm of cameras with the same calm she had shown in the cabin. Her words were measured, deliberate. "This was never about a glass of water or an overcooked steak," she said. "It was about dignity. Every passenger deserves to feel seen, respected, and valued no matter their race, their age, or their background. Until airlines understand that, stories like ours will continue." She didn't take more questions. She and Ethan moved through the flashing lights, their calm demeanor in sharp contrast to the frenzy around them. The restraint was itself a message, louder than any outburst could have been. Outside, their car waited a black sedan arranged by their London partners. As they slid inside, the door closing off the chaos, Ethan finally exhaled. "Here we go," he murmured. Elena leaned her head back against the seat. Eyes closed briefly. "Here we go." As the car pulled away from Heathrow, the twins knew the next chapter of this story would not be written in quiet lounges or hushed cabins. It would play out on screens across the world, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, and in the hearts of every passenger who had ever felt unseen. They had not asked for this battle, but now that it was theirs, they intended to win it not just for themselves, but for everyone who would come after. By the time Ethan and Elena reached their hotel in Mayfair, the firestorm had already ignited. What began as whispers on Twitter during the transatlantic flight had exploded into full-fledged headlines splashed across every major news outlet. First-class racism, Sky Nova passenger claims, discrimination at 35,000 feet. Tech twins targeted on flight to London. Airline purser fired mid-air. Luxury in the skies, or prejudice in the cabin. The Carters hadn't said much publicly yet, but the vacuum of information only fueled speculation. Clips recorded discreetly by other first-class passengers were already circulating. Susan Doyle ignoring Ethan's raised hand, the heated moment when Elena pressed the call button again and again, the gasp when Margaret Doyle muttered, "People like you." The footage was grainy, incomplete, but devastating. The siblings sat side by side on the plush velvet couch of their suite, their phones buzzing like alarm clocks that would never turn off. "This is spiraling," Ethan said, scrolling through the flood of hashtags. "We're trending in 6 countries. Stock analysts are already calling this a brand crisis." Elena's gaze was steady. "Good. Let them feel the heat. But we can't let the narrative get hijacked. We decide how this story is told." Her phone lit up with an incoming call, an editor from the New York Times. She ignored it. Another buzz. BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera. She set the phone down and took a long breath. "They'll spin it," she said. "Some outlets will soften it. Others will sensationalize it. But if we speak, we have to speak once, clearly, decisively. No room for distortion." Ethan nodded slowly. "So, who gets the interview?" Elena leaned back, eyes narrowing in thought. "Someone credible. Someone who won't cut sound bites into clickbait. We'll pick one and let the rest chase the shadows." As they debated, the corporate machine of Sky Nova churned restlessly. In a glass tower overlooking London, the airline's crisis team had convened an emergency meeting. The CEO, Richard Lawson, a man whose charisma had carried him through boardrooms but not through scandals, sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight. "This cannot define us," he barked, stabbing a finger toward a projection screen filled with live tweets. "We are a premium airline. We do not tolerate discrimination." A junior PR officer cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, the passengers involved are not just anyone. They're Ethan and Elena Carter, Nexus Innovations. Their company is valued at $9 billion. They have direct ties to Kensington Capital." The room stiffened. Everyone knew what that meant. Kensington Capital wasn't just money, it was influence, the kind that could bend governments and topple CEOs. Lawson's face drained of color. "Get me Thomas Gray," he said at last, naming the airline's regional director. "And draft a statement, acknowledge the incident, confirm the purser's termination, emphasize our zero-tolerance policy. We need to contain this." But containment was already impossible. That night, Elena sat across from journalist Maya Sterling of the Financial Herald. The choice had been deliberate. Maya was known for nuance, for weaving human stories into the cold fabric of finance. If anyone could capture both the pain and the larger implications, it was her. The cameras were minimal, the setting intimate. Elena wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, no makeup beyond what the lights demanded. Ethan sat beside her, silent but present, his role to anchor rather than lead. Maya leaned forward. "Elena." "Ethan, thank you for speaking with me. The world has seen fragments, clips, second-hand accounts. What happened on Flight 74, in your own words?" Elena took a slow breath. Her voice, when it came, was calm, deliberate. It began with silence. She said, a silence more deliberate than words. No greeting, no eye contact, no offer of service. Every other passenger in that cabin was seen. We were not. That silence grew into action, skipping us during service, denying our requests, serving inedible food. And when we finally spoke up, it became words, words that cut deeper than neglect. "People like you." The camera captured her stillness, the precision of her language. This was never about a glass of water, she continued. It was about dignity. About the quiet ways prejudice tells people they don't belong, even when they paid the same price, worked twice as hard, and earned their place 10 times over. Maya let the words breathe. Some might argue it was just one employee. A bad apple, as corporations like to say. Elena's eyes sharpened. When someone feels bold enough to act that way after 20 years of service, it's not just one apple. It's the orchard. It's the culture that watered and protected it. And until companies admit that, they'll keep harvesting the same fruit. Ethan finally spoke, his tone steady as granite. "We're not seeking apologies or perks. We're seeking accountability. We want to see airlines commit to training, protocols, and real consequences, because the next passengers might not have the platform we do. They shouldn't need one to be treated as human." The interview lasted 40 minutes, but by morning it had been distilled into clips that spread like wildfire. Elena's phrase, "not a glass of water, but dignity," trended worldwide. Ethan's call for accountability echoed in editorials from The Guardian to The Wall Street Journal. Sky Nova's stock plunged 8% in a single day. Rival airlines issued preemptive statements reaffirming their commitment to diversity, eager to avoid being next in the crosshairs. Passengers flooded social media with their own stories of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination in the skies. In the Carter suite, the phones buzzed endlessly. Invitations poured in from government committees, advocacy groups, talk shows, even late-night hosts. Some wanted a story, others wanted a symbol. Everyone wanted a piece of them. Elena scrolled through the chaos, her thumb pausing on one message, a young woman named Chloe, the flight attendant who had eventually broken her silence. "I meant what I said. I won't stay silent again. Thank you for standing your ground. You gave me courage." Elena smiled faintly. In the noise of headlines and stock charts, that message mattered most. Change didn't begin in boardrooms or press conferences. It began in the quiet decisions of ordinary people who decided silence was no longer enough. Still, as night fell over London, she couldn't shake the weight pressing on her chest. She replayed Margaret Doyle's sneer, her words heavy with contempt. The wound was still raw. In the darkness, Ethan's voice came low. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Elena nodded. She's sitting somewhere right now, telling herself she's the victim, that we pulled strings, that we played a card. She won't learn. She'll just rot in bitterness. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. Maybe, but that's her burden to carry. Ours is to turn this into something larger than her, something lasting. She exhaled, the tension easing slightly. Something lasting. She repeated, and as the city lights glowed beyond their window, the twins understood the firestorm was no longer just about them. It was about every unseen passenger, every silenced complaint, every quiet act of prejudice that had been dismissed as misunderstanding. Their story was now the world's story, and the world was finally listening. The boardroom of Sky Nova's London headquarters was a gleaming circle of glass and chrome perched above the Thames. But on this morning, it felt less like a seat of power and more like a tribunal. The executives sat rigid around the polished table, faces drawn, collars stiff. Richard Lawson, the CEO, entered late. His suit was immaculate, but there was sweat at his temples. He carried himself like a man who knew the eyes of the world were on him. The first words out of his mouth were clipped. "We are bleeding." The chief financial officer slid a chart across the table. Stock price down 11% in 48 hours. Bookings in premium cabins plummeting. Corporate clients calling to reconsider long-term contracts. It isn't just bad press, the CFO said. It's trust, and trust is harder to rebuild than any balance sheet. A grim silence followed. Then the head of communications spoke, her voice low but urgent. The Carter's interview has framed this perfectly. Not about perks, not about luxury, about dignity. We can't spin against that. If we minimize it, we look cruel. If we deny it, we look dishonest. If we stay silent, we look guilty. We're trapped. Richard Lawson's fist tightened on the table. Then we fight back. One rogue employee cannot be allowed to define an entire airline. The head of HR cleared his throat cautiously. Except she wasn't rogue. Margaret Doyle had file complaints that were quietly dismissed. Too senior, too well connected in the union. If this comes out, the rogue employee defense collapses. The room chilled. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, a voice from the far end of the table. Thomas Gray, regional director. His calm tone cut through the panic. Then we have to stop treating this as a PR crisis and start treating it as a reckoning. Because that's what it is. They're not asking for apologies. They're demanding structural change. And unless we give it, the market, the press, and our passengers will take it from us. Across the city, in the Mayfair suite, Ethan and Elena were already several moves ahead. They sat at a long dining table, laptops open, a digital war room humming. Notifications flooded their screens, messages from journalists, activists, even politicians offering platforms and partnerships. But their focus was elsewhere. On the screen before them was Arthur Kensington, their mentor and the silent power behind Kensington Capital. His silver hair and tailored suit were framed by the mahogany of his office. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of someone who had bent industries to his will. "You've made your point," Arthur said. "The world is listening. Now tell me, what do you want me to do?" Ethan spoke first, measured and deliberate. Sky Nova won't change out of guilt. They'll change out of fear. They need to understand this isn't a story that will fade. It's a structural liability. Their shareholders need to feel it. Arthur's eyes gleamed faintly. Shareholders always feel it first. "You're suggesting pressure from the top." Elena leaned in. "Exactly. The Carters versus one purser is a human interest story. But if Kensington Capital questions its stake in Sky Nova, it becomes existential. They'll bend, Arthur, or they'll break." For a moment, Arthur said nothing. Then he gave a small, approving nod. "Very well. I'll place a call to their board chair. Not as a threat yet, but as a reminder. They need to understand the cost of inaction." When the call ended, Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "We've set the board on fire," he murmured. "No," Elena corrected softly. "We've just given them a choice: rebuild the orchard or watch it burn." Back in the glass tower, the board meeting had turned chaotic. A call had come through during the session from Kensington Capital itself. The message was polite, almost deceptively mild. We are monitoring this situation closely. The continued association of our capital with Sky Nova is contingent on demonstrable accountability and reform. Every executive in the room felt the weight of those words. It wasn't just about passengers anymore, it was about survival. We need to announce a task force, the communications chief said quickly. Independent oversight, mandatory anti-bias training, public commitments, the works. Richard Lawson's jaw clenched. Do you understand what that looks like? It looks like we're admitting guilt. Thomas Gray's reply was sharp. We are guilty, and if we don't admit it, we'll lose everything. By evening, Sky Nova issued a statement. It was longer than most, heavy with corporate jargon, but the world dissected every word. They admitted serious failures in upholding dignity and respect for all passengers. They confirmed Margaret Doyle's termination. They announced a full review of crew training and passenger equity protocols. But it was Elena Carter's response, posted minutes later on her own feed, that captured the public imagination. Words are wind. We welcome commitments, but only actions will matter. Passengers deserve more than apologies. They deserve transformation. Within an hour, her post had been shared 200,000 times. Late that night, the twins sat together in the quiet of their suite, exhaustion finally creeping into their bones. The city outside was alive with lights, but inside, the air was heavy with the weight of what they had set in motion. Ethan poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, sliding one to his sister. Do you ever wonder, he asked softly, if we're turning into the very thing people accuse us of, power players? Pulling strings behind closed doors, Elena studied him, then set her glass down. I wonder every day. But then I remember the look on Susan's face when she told us we didn't belong. And I think of the thousands who never get the chance to push back. If us pulling strings means their battles get a little easier, then I can live with that. Ethan was silent, turning her words over. Finally, he nodded. Then we do this. Not for us. For them. The next morning, headlines screamed of Sky Nova's pledge to lead the industry in equity and accountability. Investors remained skittish, but there was a sliver of optimism. Activists called for legislation. Former employees began sharing their own stories of bias. The ripple was becoming a wave, and at the center of it, the Carter twins sat quietly, plotting the next move. They hadn't asked for this war, but they had been handed it. And now, armed with leverage, truth, and unshakable resolve, they intended to win it not just for themselves, but for every unseen passenger who had ever felt invisible in a world that claimed to serve them. The reckoning had only just begun. For days after Sky Nova's carefully crafted statement, the air was thick with anticipation. Everyone from journalists to investors to ordinary travelers was waiting to see if the words would materialize into something real. They didn't have to wait long. The first crack appeared when a former flight attendant, now retired, published a raw account on her blog. She described years of working under Margaret Doyle, years of whispered complaints that never left the crew rest areas. She wrote about the subtle hierarchy Doyle enforced, who she deemed worthy of smiles, who was invisible, who was treated as an inconvenience. Her words spread like wildfire. Others followed. Current employees, emboldened by anonymity on social platforms, began sharing their stories. Patterns emerged: disproportionate scrutiny of passengers of color, dismissive treatment of non-English speakers, resentment toward families upgraded to business or first class. Sky Nova's inbox became a flood of testimonials. Each one was a cut. And together, they painted a damning picture. This wasn't one purser. This was a culture. Elena read them late at night, her laptop glowing in the dim hotel room. Ethan had already drifted off in the next room, his breathing slow and steady. She scrolled through the stories with a tight chest, one from a young Latina woman who had saved up for her first international trip, only to be asked repeatedly if she was in the right seat. Another from an older black man who described being told by a crew member to be patient. Real customers come first. Each story was a reflection, a shard of the same glass that had cut her and her brother at 35,000 feet. She shut the laptop and sat quietly in the dark, torn between fury and exhaustion. Was it enough to call for reform, or did reform mean nothing without dismantling the very walls that allowed prejudice to thrive the next morning? Over coffee. Ethan noticed the shadows under her eyes. "You didn't sleep." "I couldn't," she admitted. "It's bigger than us." "Ethan, it's systemic. How do you fix something so woven into the fabric?" Ethan stirred his coffee slowly, his gaze steady. "One thread at a time. We don't burn the fabric. We reweave it." Meanwhile, the legal world was circling. A coalition of civil rights lawyers filed a motion demanding that the FAA investigate Skynova's discriminatory practices. Lawmakers in Washington began making statements, calling for hearings on systemic bias in air travel. It was no longer a story, it was becoming a movement. At the heart of it, Ethan and Elena found themselves cast in roles they hadn't auditioned for, reluctant leaders of a cause. Their inbox was filled with pleas for help, stories from strangers across the world asking them to keep speaking, to not let the momentum fade. One evening, they met with Arthur Kensington again, this time joined by representatives from other major investors. The conference room hummed with power, the kind that could redirect entire industries. Arthur spoke first. "The reckoning is spreading. Investors are nervous, but nervousness can be harnessed. You have the leverage to push Skynova into real reform, and perhaps more than that, to set a precedent for the entire industry." A woman from another firm leaned forward. "If you push for systemic changes, mandatory bias training, transparent passenger complaint reporting, executive accountability, we'll support it, but it needs to be tangible, measurable, not just another PR exercise." Elena's voice was calm but resolute. "Then let's make it measurable. Public reporting of complaints and resolutions. Independent oversight. Executive bonuses tied to equity metrics. If they want passengers' trust back, they have to earn it." The room buzzed with murmurs of approval. That night, back at the suite, Ethan wrestled with his thoughts. He paced the room, the London skyline twinkling through the window. "Are we doing the right thing?" he asked suddenly. Elena looked up from her notes. "What do you mean, we're entrepreneurs, not activists? We built Nexus to innovate supply chains, not dismantle discrimination. What if we're overstepping? What if we become symbols instead of ourselves?" Elena closed her notebook, her gaze softening. "Do you remember what Mom used to say? Life doesn't ask if you're ready. It asks if you're willing. We didn't ask for this fight, Ethan, but it found us. And maybe we're in this position because we're strong enough to carry it." Ethan stopped pacing. Slowly, he nodded. The turning tide became undeniable when Skynova's board announced the creation of a Civil Rights Oversight Council, independent of the airline's leadership. It would review all passenger complaints related to discrimination and publish quarterly reports. For the first time, accountability wouldn't be hidden in filing cabinets. The announcement shook the industry. Other airlines scrambled to get ahead of the wave, issuing their own promises of reform. But passengers weren't satisfied with promises anymore. They wanted proof. Elena and Ethan gave it to them. In a widely televised press conference, the twins unveiled a new initiative funded through Kensington Capital and Nexus Innovations, the Open Skies Project. Its mission was simple but revolutionary: to create a transparent platform where passengers could log incidents of discrimination, accessible to regulators, investors, and the public. Standing on the stage, Elena's voice carried the weight of every sleepless night. Dignity should not be negotiable. The price of your ticket should be the only measure of service. We will not rest until that principle is reality, not rhetoric. The applause was thunderous, but behind the scenes, they both knew the war was far from over. There would be resistance, lawsuits, smear campaigns. Power never yielded without a fight. Later that evening, sitting by the hotel window, Ethan finally allowed himself a rare smile. You realize we just turned one overcooked steak into an industry-wide accountability system. Elena chuckled softly. Poetic, isn't it? They wanted to deny us a glass of water. Instead, they gave us a platform to reshape the skies. But even as laughter filled the room, there was a flicker of unease in Elena's chest. She wondered how far this would go, how much of themselves they would have to give. Change was never free, and she knew the bill was still coming. The tide had turned. But tides, she also knew, could just as easily drown those who failed to keep their footing. The morning newspapers in London carried their faces on the front page. Ethan and Elena Carter, once known only in tech and venture circles, were now headline fixtures. The twins who grounded Sky Nova read one tabloid. From code to change agents, another proclaimed. Their names had become shorthand for a movement bigger than themselves. At first, it felt surreal. Strangers approached them in cafes, offering thanks and congratulations. Activists sent messages of solidarity. Passengers from around the world wrote to say that because of them, they finally felt seen. It was intoxicating. But then came the other side. Comment sections brimmed with vitriol. Anonymous accounts accused them of playing the race card, of seeking attention, of trying to ruin hard-working employees. Editorials in certain business outlets warned that their corporate crusade was dangerous, that mixing activism with investment threatened stability. And, behind the curtain, powerful people who thrived in the old order began to whisper. One evening, Ethan scrolled through his phone while Elena prepared tea. He stopped cold, his jaw tightening. A headline screamed across the screen, Carter twins face investor revolt calls to step down from Nexus. Elena set the teapot down too hard, porcelain clinking. They wouldn't dare. They might, Ethan replied, his voice low. Some investors don't like us drawing this much fire. They signed up for logistics profits, not public crusades. If they think our activism jeopardizes the bottom line, they'll push back. The words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't just their reputations at stake. It was the company they had built from a dorm room, the empire that represented every sacrifice they had ever made. Later that night, Ethan lay awake staring at the ceiling. His mind replayed every boardroom battle, every late-night coding session, every risk they had taken to build Nexus. And now, to think that the company could be threatened not by competitors, but by their own stand for dignity, it gnawed at him. In the next room, Elena wrestled with her own turmoil. She thought of their parents, who had worked long hours to give them opportunities they never had. She thought of every young black entrepreneur who looked to them as proof that success was possible. If they backed down now, what message would that send by morning? They were both drained, but resolute. Over breakfast, Ethan finally broke the silence. We can't let them push us out of our own company. We can't let them weaponize our cause against us. Elena stirred her coffee slowly. Then we fight. Not with anger, not with chaos, with clarity, We remind them that Nexus thrives because we built it with integrity. And integrity isn't a liability. It's the only real asset. Their resolve would be tested almost immediately. At a shareholder meeting streamed from London, they faced pointed questions. One investor, a sharp-tongued hedge fund manager, accused them of jeopardizing returns by dabbling in activism. Elena's response was calm, measured, but unflinching. Respectfully, we're not dabbling. We're leading. Discrimination in the airline industry threatens stability, brand value, and consumer trust. Addressing it is not charity. It's strategy. Companies that ignore dignity lose customers. Companies that embrace it build loyalty, and loyalty is the most valuable currency in business. The room fell quiet. The investor shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't press further. Ethan added, "If you want profits without principle, you invested in the wrong founders. We won't build wealth on the backs of silence." Afterward, Arthur Kensington called them. His deep voice carried a rare warmth. "You handled that perfectly. Shareholders respect strength, but they also respect foresight. Keep making the case that dignity and profitability aren't opposites, but allies. The tide will turn." Still, the strain weighed on them. In quiet moments, Ethan's doubts resurfaced. What if they lost Nexus? What if all of this ended with them as martyrs but not leaders? One night, walking along the Thames after another long day of meetings, he confessed to Elena, "Sometimes I wish we could just go back. Back to the days when it was just us and a laptop in that dorm room. No cameras, no causes, just building." Elena slipped her arm through his. "I know. But if we were still in that dorm, building code, and someone asked us if we'd stand up when it mattered, what would we have said?" He sighed, looking out at the water, the city lights shimmering like restless stars. "We'd have said yes, without hesitation." She squeezed his arm gently. "Then that's our answer." While they wrestled with their personal storms, the external tide kept rising. In Washington, hearings on bias in air travel began. Former passengers testified with searing accounts. Airline CEOs were summoned to explain their policies. The Carter twins' names were invoked repeatedly as catalysts of the movement. Other industries began to take notice. Hotel chains announced their own equity reviews. Rideshare companies pledged transparent complaint reporting. What began as one ugly night on Apex Flight 74 had become a spark illuminating a far broader landscape. But with visibility came vulnerability. Anonymous threats arrived in their inbox. Protesters gathered outside Sky Nova offices, some peaceful, others hostile. Commentators on television debated their every move, dissecting not just their business strategies, but their personal lives. The twins leaned on each other as never before. When Ethan's doubts surged, Elena steadied him. When Elena's exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, Ethan reminded her why they had started. Their bond, tested by adversity, grew only stronger. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, they returned to their suite to find a handwritten letter slipped under the door. It was from a young flight attendant named Chloe, who had quietly served them on that fateful night. Her words were simple but powerful. "I didn't have the courage to speak then, but I see what you are doing now. You are giving all of us permission to do better. Thank you." Elena read it aloud, her voice breaking. Ethan took the letter from her, folding it carefully as if it were something sacred. "That," he said quietly, "is why we can't stop." In that moment, the noise of headlines and shareholders and hearings faded. What remained was the truth. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced at 35,000 feet. The weight of being symbols was heavy, crushing at times, but it was also a gift, a responsibility, and perhaps the most important role they would ever play. And as the world shifted, as policies changed and industries re-examined their foundations, Ethan and Elena Carter realized something profound. Their story wasn't just about one flight, one purser, or even one airline. It was about the future of dignity itself, and they were determined to carry that weight all the way. 6 months after that night in the skies, the world felt different. The name Sky Nova no longer conjured images of luxury cabins and global prestige. Instead, it evoked hearings, reforms, and the scandal that had forced the airline to remake itself. For Ethan and Elena Carter, the whirlwind had not slowed. They had become reluctant ambassadors for equity in travel, their every move chronicled by the press. Yet beneath the noise, they remained who they had always been, siblings bound by love, resilience, and a quiet determination to build. The Open Skies project had grown beyond their wildest expectations. What began as a modest platform to log passenger complaints had become an industry-wide accountability system. Regulators adopted its framework, airlines scrambled to integrate it, and, most importantly, passengers who once felt powerless now had a voice that mattered. Elena stood on the stage of a packed auditorium in New York, addressing industry leaders at the first annual Open Skies Summit. She spoke not as a victim, not even as a symbol, but as a leader. "This isn't about one flight," she said, her voice steady and warm. "It's about every passenger who has ever been told they don't belong. It's about every moment when dignity was treated as optional. That era is over. The skies belong to all of us." The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. In the front row, Ethan watched with quiet pride, remembering the younger sister who used to sketch dreams on napkins in their dorm cafeteria. She had become a force the world could no longer ignore. But not everyone in that auditorium was celebrating. In a modest home on the outskirts of Newark, Susan Reynolds watched the broadcast on an old television. The once proud purser was a shadow of her former self. The savings were gone. The dream of her cafe had evaporated after investors pulled out. Her name, once synonymous with professionalism, had become a case study in bias. She had applied for dozens of jobs, only to be met with polite rejections or outright silence. The industry she had devoted her life to had closed its doors forever. Even small businesses were wary, afraid of the association with her scandal. As Elena's words filled the room, Susan's grip on the remote tightened until her knuckles turned white. She switched the channel, but the story was everywhere: news, business networks, even morning talk shows. She could not escape it. For the first time, the weight of denial cracked. Alone in her faded living room, she whispered aloud, "It was me. I did this." The admission left her trembling. It was not redemption, only recognition. But it was more honesty than she had managed in months. Back in Manhattan, the Carter twins sat with Arthur Kensington in his corner office overlooking the skyline. The view stretched endlessly, the city alive beneath them. Arthur leaned back in his chair, studying them with a rare softness. "You've turned pain into power," he said, "but power has a way of demanding more. Are you ready for what comes next?" Ethan exchanged a glance with Elena. She nodded slowly. "We didn't choose this path, Arthur, but now that we're on it, we'll walk it, whatever it takes." Arthur smiled faintly. "Good, because the fight doesn't end here. Airlines will adapt, but prejudice doesn't vanish overnight. The real work begins now, sustaining change, embedding it so deeply it cannot be undone." In the weeks that followed, the Open Skies project expanded into hotels, rail, and even rideshare platforms. A movement that began with a steak and a glass of water had become a global call for dignity in every form of travel. Ethan sometimes marveled at the irony. They tried to make us invisible, he told Elena one evening. Instead, they made us unforgettable. She smiled. That's the lesson. You can try to erase people, but in doing so, you write them deeper into history. The twins continued to carry the weight of their new roles, but they also learned to find joy again. They traveled, not in first class, but sometimes incognito in coach, listening quietly to the experiences of ordinary passengers. They shared dinners with families who had written to them. They created scholarships for young aviation students from underrepresented backgrounds. Their lives were fuller, heavier, and yet more purposeful than ever before. One evening, months later, they stood together on a balcony overlooking Central Park. The city pulsed with life below them, neon lights shimmering like veins of energy. Ethan raised a glass of sparkling water. To dignity, he said simply. Elena clinked her glass against his. To the skies, and to never being invisible again. They drank in silence, the hum of the city beneath them, the memory of that night on Flight 74 forever etched into their bones. For Susan Reynolds, the story ended differently. In a cruel twist of fate, her name became part of airline training manuals across the industry. Case studies dissected her actions, her words, her downfall. Flight attendants around the world learned of her not as a mentor, but as a warning. Her prejudice had cost her everything. But in losing, she had unwittingly paved the way for change she could never have imagined. The Carters, meanwhile, carried forward. They knew the fight was far from over, but they also knew that justice, though slow, had wings. And sometimes it took flight in the unlikeliest of places, a cramped cabin, 35,000 feet above the earth. Their legacy was not wealth, though they had plenty. It was not fame, though the world now knew their names. It was dignity, pure, undeniable, unshakable dignity, the true currency of humanity. And as long as they drew breath, they would never stop investing in it. The flight ended, but the story never did. From that night on, Flight 74, Ethan and Elena Carter carried more than their luggage into Heathrow. They carried a message that rippled across continents. Dignity is not a luxury. It is a right. What began as two ignored passengers turned into hearings, reforms, and a global movement demanding equity in every mile of travel. And yet, this is not just their story. It is about all of us, about every time someone was made to feel invisible, every moment when silence was chosen over courage. The Carters proved that strength can be calm, power can be quiet, and justice can arrive in the most unexpected ways, even on a red-eye flight. As you listen to this ending, ask yourself, what seat do you claim in the fight for dignity? And what will you do when the moment comes to stand? If this story touched you, let it live beyond this screen. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to remember that respect should never be optional. And subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice, resilience, and humanity that will move you and stay with you long after the credits fade.